A month ago, Cliven Bundy was a little-known Nevada cattle rancher fighting the federal government over grazing fees. He became a conservative folk hero of sorts, and supporters filled his farm 80 miles outside of Las Vegas, protesting the seizure of 900 head of his cattle. The protest escalated, resulting in a standoff between an armed militia and the Bureau of Land Management. Senator Rand Paul and Dean Heller backed Bundy until a story in the New York Times that ran these comments.
I want to tell you one more thing I know about the Negro. The older people and the kids, and there's always at least a half a dozen people sitting on the porch. They didn't have nothing to do. They didn't have nothing for their kids to do. They didn't have nothing for their young girls to do. And because they were basically on government subsidy, and so now what do? They abort their young children. They put their young men in jail, because they never learned how to pick cotton. And I've often wondered, are they better off as slaves, picking cotton, having family life and doing things, or are they better off under government subsidy?
After the New York Times ran its story, other local and national media jumped on board. It was the Washington Post that first got its hands on that recording that we had just heard. There was one news agency, though, that was noticeably quiet on the subject. Here's Howard Kurtz on Fox's Media Buzz.
In my view, Fox News fell seriously short on this story on Thursday, all day long until special report at 6 p.m. Eastern. And there was virtually no mention of these racist remarks by Clive Bundy when everybody else was covering it. And I think that to ignore a major story that was on the front page of the New York Times at a time when the network, among others, as you say, had devoted a lot of time to covering this story and to building up Clive Bundy, I think that gives ammunition to Fox's detractors.
There are a lot of folks who sit in chairs just like ours who are giving Kurtz a whole lot of credit for going out there and saying that.
Well, I mean, I think he's stating the obvious, and I'm glad he did it on his show. I mean, there have been some questions before about whether he's, withheld his punches on some things that Fox has done since he took his show over to Fox. But this time, I mean, it was so obvious. It was so patently obvious that Fox did not come to that story soon enough. I mean, they did do it later on their talk shows or whatever, but they didn't come to it soon enough, and he should call them out.
I think the whole issue here, I mean, it sort of goes back to the story we just got to talking about involving the Clippers, is that, when the news media just pretty much opens up the mic or records what's going on and presents it out there to the public, they're pretty much doing their job, especially in instances like this, when you have people who basically make very ignorant statements, such as Cliven Bundy. It's just, you just gotta let them do it. And for the network, Fox Network or any other network, not to acknowledge that as a problem and denounce that, I think that speaks volumes about where they stand in terms of where we are as a media in this country.
And, anytime, whether it's conservative or liberal media, takes somebody and builds them up, as this hero figure around whatever ideological point they're trying to make about a story, they're likely to fall into this trap because people have flaws, and some people have really big, unforgivable flaws, and you build them up, it's going to take you down.
And I also think that what we really need to do in the media is, especially those of us who engage in punditry, is to do a little bit of investigation on the people in which we're going to support. Because he's had a history of doing this. I mean, those who have heard these statements then went back and started doing some homework on him, found out that, wait a minute, he said these kinds of things before. This isn't anything new. So when pundits jump on bandwagons, they need to do some homework before they endorse someone as a potential spokesman.
I do have one question about this story that I would love to see answered at some point. Don't know if it ever will be. According to Adam Nagurney, who wrote this piece in the New York Times, the first story about it, the remarks came out at what was supposed to be a news conference, one of many that Bundy has been holding. Only one reporter and one photographer, he says in his story, showed up. Does that mean that reporter was him? Or if the tape came to the Washington Post, did the Washington Post have the only reporter there who decided they weren't going to break the story? and the New York Times was. Instead, it's a little bit fuzzy, but if only one reporter was there, somehow it was either the Times reporter who was there and didn't acknowledge that, or they got it through some other intermediary. And it was almost like Nagorny wasn't quite sure what to do with it when he first got the tape, because he buried, I mean, in the lead paragraph, there was a little mention of talking about race, but he buried that story well down in a lengthy piece about what Bundy was talking about.
And I think the larger issue here is when you're talking about, at least Bundy is talking about government subsidies and that sort of thing. I'm looking at this and going like, well, wait a minute, you're using government land for your cattle herd, and you're basically saying that the government shouldn't have any say in that. Last time I checked, that's a government subsidy as well. So to say that, African Americans or some African Americans or some poor people are living on government subsidies and you're not, that's sort of, I don't know.
The math doesn't work out.
Yeah, it just doesn't work out very well.
And he's just a poor case study for an issue that is a significant real issue out west.